And my job, really, I had a staff of several dozen people. My job was to get them and for me to convince these countries to accept these very large loans, to get the banks to make the loans, to set up the deal so that the money went to big U.S. corporations. The country was left holding a huge debt, and then I would go in, or one of my people would go in and say, look, you know, you owe us all this money, you can't pay your debts. The same thing's going to happen to him that happened to Jaime Roldos in Ecuador, and Omar Torrijos in Panama, and Allende in Chile, and we tried to do it to Chavez in Venezuela, and are still trying, that we will send in the people to try to overthrow him, as in fact we recently did with the president of Ecuador, or if we don't overthrow him, we will assassinate him. And these people all know the history. They know that this has happened many, many, many times in the past. The other thing we do, Amy, and what's going on right now in Latin America, is that as soon as one of these anti-American presidents is elected, such as Evo Morales, who you mentioned in Bolivia, one of us goes in and says, hey, congratulations, Mr. President. Now that you're president, I just want to tell you that I can make you very, very rich, you and your family. Get several $100 million in this pocket if you play the game our way. If you decide not to, over in this pocket I've got a gun with a bullet with your name on it in case you decide to keep your campaign promises and throw us out. What he said is oil from Ecuador has to serve the interests of the Ecuadorian people. Therefore, the oil companies are going to have to pay a lot greater share to the Ecuadorian people, or we're going to nationalize them. And he'd run on a very, very strong anti-American campaign. And we, knew that if he didn't change his ways, something would happen to him. We economic hitmen during the last 30, 40 years have really created the world's first truly global empire. And we've done this primarily through economics, in the military only coming in as a last resort.
To Basra and all Iraq comes good news with the opening of a new oil field. The pipeline runs across the desert to the Persian Gulf at Fayal. There, tankers load up with the precious fuel the world needs so badly. Yes, it's a big day for Iraq, and there's a feast to celebrate. Sheep stuffed with rice and a host of other good things. But that's only the first of the good things that will come to Iraq, thanks to oil.
For the next 12 years, sanctions were the main weapons the US and its allies used against Iraq. Principal among these sanctions was limiting its oil production, causing financial hardship.
Literally, Iraq was banned from getting just about anything. And as a result, without the ability to conduct trade, the economy degenerated, drastically throughout the 90s.
It should come as no surprise that the dollar is everything. The US dollar is the world's major currency. It accounts for approximately 2/3 of all the world's exchange reserves. Half the world's exports are done in dollars. All International Monetary Fund loans are made in dollars. And if you want to buy oil on the international market, the currency is the US dollar. But what would happen if some other currency threatened that position? With 12 countries already using it, and a further 15 waiting in the wings to convert to it, the euro is the fastest growing currency in the world. If the euro was to become the new international currency, the US might not take it lying down. With the mighty dollar's position as the world #1 suddenly under threat, did a ripple of fear go through the Bush administration?
From 2001 to the very beginning of the war, Iraq exported about 3.3 billion barrels of oil. We bought 2.5 of those billion. We bought 2/3 of the oil, but we had to pay in euros. We couldn't have the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve cannot print euros. So we have to sell GMs to Europe to get the euros, or whatever we sell to Europe, goods and services, in order to get the euros to buy the oil from Iraq. So the petrodollar recycling system began to break down.
Teetering on the knife edge of financial meltdown, the US has always needed to keep a firm hand on the trading of its oil dollars. But in November 2000, the most serious attack on the sacred dollar was about to take place. If left unchecked, it could have been an economic Pearl Harbor. After years of struggling under crippling sanctions, Saddam Hussein decided to use the one WMD that no one had ever looked for or even thought about: the euro. Immediately, George W. Bush declared war on terrorism.
Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
In October 2001, the US invaded Afghanistan in a bid to smash the Taliban and Al-Qaeda mastermind Osama bin Laden, who Bush held responsible for the 9/11 attacks. But after months of bitter fighting, bin Laden had still not been captured. So Bush turned his search to an old enemy of his family, Saddam Hussein.
The war on terror involves Saddam Hussein because of Al-Qaeda connections, because of his history. He's a danger to the American people, and we got to deal with him.
Obviously, they didn't go into Iraq for weapons of mass destruction, for the simple reason that the United States provided Saddam Hussein with all his weapons of mass destruction, or the precursors. So the US knew exactly what was in there. They had to pull the wool over the public's eyes.
The US knew, and we know that they knew it, that Iraq had no weapon systems, no unconventional, that is biological, chemical or nuclear weapon systems, nor had they had any probably since 1991 or 1992, because U.S.-led weapons inspectors had carried out more than 9,000 inspections during the 1990s, going everywhere in the country with almost unfettered access. And so the Bush administration knew full well that there was no weapons of mass destruction.
All along, the war was just about oil. Every country needs oil to survive. But the US is utterly dependent on this stuff they call black gold. Although it only has 5% of the world's population, the US uses 25% of the world's oil supplies. And now, with oil supplies dwindling, and with countries like China competing for what's left under the ground, US officials think they need to secure and control as much foreign oil as they possibly can. And most of the foreign oil that's under the ground is in the Middle East, in particular Saudi Arabia and its neighbour Iraq.
Before the war, Saddam controlled a country with a quarter of the world's oil production, containing more than 115 billion barrels of oil in reserve. Iraq was swimming in oil. It was a tempting target.
You know, they can insist that oil had nothing to do with why they went in there, but the fact is they went in very quickly and took over the oil administration, privatized it, which it had been nationalized, and is nationalized in most Arabic countries, and locked out French and German and Russian companies and gave all the contracts to British and American companies.
By invading Iraq, Bush had seized all of its oil fields. Once they've been updated, production will increase to 3 million barrels a day, twice the 2002 levels. Some estimate that the final production will rise to 6 million barrels a day, and threaten to undermine all other oil producers. With the Iraqi oil industry firmly under US control, there was just one final task left to do.
The other big secret is the first thing the Bush administration did when they took over Iraq in May of 2003 was immediately reconvert Iraq's oil transactions from the euro back to the dollar, even though from an economic perspective it was in Iraq's favor because the euro was worth about 17% more than the dollar. So he basically wiped out 17% of their entire profits by going back to the dollar.
While all this was happening, the American public was given very little information about how important oil and the petrodollars were to the US. So was there also a media conspiracy